Soulframe's storyline is full of Fae magic. But what are the Fae? And what do they have to do with our envoy? Let's take a closer look at what we know about the Fae so far in Soulframe lore. According to the story of Oro's Well, the Fae inhabited Midrath before humans and were favored with the gift of magic by Alka, our planet. We don't know exactly what the Fae looked like. The Oro's Well lore mentioned that they serenaded Iridis, the moon god, with the voices of owls and crickets, but it's unclear how literal this passage is meant to be. It could be a poetic way of describing the nocturnal gathering of ancient Fae, or it could mean that the Fae took the shapes of owls and crickets, in which case perhaps our omen beasts are also a type of Fae. But there is a reference to fauna preceding the Fae, so omen beasts could be their own type of magical entity. At the very least, we know that Allora, Oshelda, Tethran, and Siren were all Fae, and while the last three look just like our envoy, Allora has a strikingly unique appearance. This might have to do with her status as the Empress of the Fae, or the three wilds could be part human. The game isn't clear on this yet. But before we talk more about the Fae we know, let's return to Oro's Well. The history of this location tells us that when the first of the Fae gathered to serenade Iridis, he shone a moonbeam through the Fae ring that carved a hole to Alka's center and became a spring imbued with magical power. At first, the Fae drew wisdom and wishes from this magical well, but in time they sipped it dry and only later was it restored by Oro, the son of Iridis. This story tells us that the Fae are just as flawed as humans, capable of both wisdom and folly, and the lore of the Coga tells us a bit more about Fae morality. The Coga was a ritual created by the Fae to maintain the natural balance of Alka. Agaric is some kind of fungal network of minds that existed on Alka even before Fae, and the Fae lived in a chaotic balance with Agaric, knowing that the will of Alka was for all to exist in a cycle of consuming and being consumed. Whenever this balance was interrupted and a creature consumed Agaric to excess, that creature would become an Agari, a foe stupid and strengthened and marked for consumption. In response, the Fae created the Coga ritual. Witches brewed an elixir that warriors drank, and then those warriors hunted the Agari, returning their bodies to the soil where they would become the Agaric they had consumed. So, the Fae are neither good nor evil, but neutral, like the cycles of nature itself, and we can see how this plays out in the story of Allora and our three wilds. We don't know much about Allora's origin aside from this poem, which tells a story of her first encounter with Midrath's world trees, which you can hear in-game narrated by Allora herself.
Wet with salt, did she exult, the isle she swam onto.
The poem is interesting for a few reasons. It seems to be told from the point of view of the world trees, and thus perhaps implies a connection between the world trees and Agaric. But given that we hear the poem in Allora's voice, I'm uncertain if we should take this as actual fact or as an expression of Allora's view of the world. That detail is particularly important because the story implies that humans were created by Alka for the amusement of Allora. But is that true, or is that just how she sees it? We really don't know just yet. We do know that she gave life to at least some of the plants of Alka, creating the Sprout Folk. We also know that her domain is Eldvale, which might be a physical place on Alka, but is more likely some type of spiritual realm. In fact, it is possible that this is somehow related to Nightfold, but we don't really know that yet. That's just my guess. For a while, humans and Fae coexisted peacefully on Midrath, perhaps after an accord struck between Allora and the Midrathian queen Finguala during their meeting at Mirafwir when Allora blessed the keep's walls. The witch general Agrona trained a battalion at Fort Kernhold, and it is unclear whether her battalion consisted entirely of Fae, or whether Fae and humans fought alongside each other. Either way, there was a peace between Fae and humans right up until the Felling. The Felling was a war between humans and Fae, and we don't know exactly how it started. We do know that it happened during the time of the first three envoys, Tethran, Oshelda, and Siren. We don't know exactly what the title of envoy meant to the Fae, but we know those first three envoys were favored by Allora and gifted weapons made from parts of her body. Tethran's sword, the Ivor, was made from Allora's femur. Oshelda's staff, the alder, was made from Allora's finger, and Siren's bow, the starling, was made with Allora's eyelash, which Siren stole from Allora before she could gift it. This doesn't seem to have angered her. In fact, she seems to find the whole thing delightfully appropriate for her favored rogue, again implying the Fae have a morality based on what is natural rather than what is good or evil. At some point, Saphine, the goddess of the blue sun, whispered something to someone that started the felling. When Soulframe still had prisms, the description for the Saphine Shadow Prism said, "A whispered word can rend the world in two. 'Twas such from Saphine's lips that spurred the Fae to felling." The implication here is that the Fae were the first to attack humans, and what followed was a bitter war for both sides. It's unclear whether the Fae were winning the war or if humans and Fae were locked in a stalemate, but the tides turned with a betrayal. Tethrin, Oshelda, and Siren fought with the humans, using their gifted weapons to strike at Allora. This is what made them her sweet betrayers, and thanks to that betrayal, the Fae retreated to Eldvale and humans took control of Midrath. We do not know what happened to Tethrin, Oshelda, and Siren after the felling, or if they are perhaps still alive somewhere. They are Fae after all, and Allora is still alive, so their lifespans may be long enough that they are still in hiding somewhere. We know that Siren had children after the felling, as his dagger Kobloth was stolen from him by his daughter, and then stolen from her by his grandson. We know that Tethrin had a half-brother named Pothos, who gifted her Thrice Spurned, 3 flyblades representing the 3 betrayers, but we don't know if this was a gift of gratitude or of regret or perhaps even a threat. And we know that Oshelda regretted her betrayal and hoped to make amends with Allora, perhaps by gifting her Estelle, the riskcasters she conjured in her guilt. But Oshelda never saw Allora again after the felling, and the finality of the wording on Estelle's item card implies that the 3 wilds are probably dead now. It's not terribly surprising that Oshelda felt such remorse, because the humans were not at all grateful to the envoys for their assistance. Instead, they detested all Fae after the felling, prosecuting them as witches. It's likely that by this point there had been some intermixing between Fae and humans, and our character Envoy certainly seems to be part human and part Fae, but it is not clear if the term Envoy now refers to any mixed-blood individual, or if it is perhaps some type of rank or a certain type of Fae. The game certainly alludes to some kind of connection between our Envoy and at least one of the 3 wilds, but it's not clear if we're a direct descendant of a wild or if that's just a reference to the shared ancestry of all envoys. It is also possible that the first 3 envoys were also the first half Fae, and that the envoys have been isolated from the rest of the Fae in punishment for their original betrayal. Perhaps because the first envoys took sides with humans, now all envoys are stuck with humans. We're also not entirely clear on how or if the powers of envoys differ from the powers of other Fae. When Grandpa is explaining how we can heal other creatures at the cost of a portion of our own soul and memories, he calls us blues, which might imply that there are different rules for envoys with scarlet arms, or might just be his term for all of us with blue blood. We see Beor, another envoy whose history we don't know yet, welcome the soul of our mother as what will presumably become a new ancestor and perhaps even pact. So the power to bond with ancestors is clearly not unique to blue-armed envoys. We don't know exactly what happened to the Fae after they retreated to Eldvale, but we'll likely find out during the new Warsongs fable coming later this year. Of course, that's not going to stop me from speculating, so here's my theory based on what we've seen so far. Beor is an envoy himself and has the scarlet arm of a killer that we hear the Wazard refer to in the Rovgot ruins. We don't know exactly what type of killing makes an envoy's arm go from blue to red, but killing the Ode clearly doesn't count. We hear Grandpa threaten Beor in the Warsongs demo by telling him to leave before he joins in his breaking oaths, and we know that the accord struck at Mirafwir involved Allora's magic. So my guess is that either killing another envoy, killing a human, or breaking the Mirafwir accord is what makes a blue arm turn red, or possibly all of the above depending on what the Mirafwir accord actually stated. We also know from that same conversation between Grandpa and Beor that the Vale lands, presumably Eldvale, are withering, which would mean Allora's survival is at stake, and wild creatures of nature will do anything to survive. Now, I do not have any advanced knowledge of what the plot of Warsongs will be, so I could be totally off on what I'm about to predict, but if you don't want Warsongs to be spoiled for you in any way, skip the rest of this video because I have a theory about a big plot twist I see coming. Thus far, we have assumed that Allora was captured by the Ode, but she does not seem very distressed in the cutscene at the very end of the Warsongs gameplay demo. Beor also looks genuinely conflicted when we first head towards the Sky Castle, as if he knows something we don't and isn't certain what side he wants to be on. So there are already some hints that Allora is not a captive, but a trap meant to lure the envoy to the Sky Castle. But listen to this. Whose voice is that? Nothing we have seen of Ode technology suggests that the spell song is something the Ode have the power to create. Ode tech is generally based on voltaics, not music. Fey magic is all about music, and the spell song certainly sounds like Allora singing with Ode in backup. I think that with Eldvale withering, Allora did what she needed to do to survive. She joined forces with the Ode. But I wouldn't assume this makes her loyal to the Ode, and there are still a lot of questions left to answer, like why make people forget? We know it helps the Ode if people forget their past and obey the invaders, but what good is that to Allora? If the Fae were responsible for starting the Felling War, perhaps forgetting that first betrayal is how Allora hopes to prevent humans from continuing the war. This would fit very nicely into Soulframe's focus on the importance of history and the need to reckon with one's past rather than trying to bury it. So, my guess is that Allora is doing anything she can to survive, including helping the Ode make us forget why we ever started fighting the Fae in the first place. But that is just my guess, and we will find out together this fall whether my interpretation is correct or if DE has even bigger surprises in store for us. I hope you enjoyed this foray into Fae lore. Tell me in the comments who your favorite Fae is, and until next time, happy hunting!